Long before Gears of War, Grand Theft Auto 3, and Vanquish, arcade developers were hard at work trying to invent the third-person shooter genre. We already covered the two Crossed Swords games from SNK released back in the early 1990s, but there are other memorable attempts that predated the Neo Geo by several years. One of my favorites is the unofficial Seibu Kaihatsu trilogy, which consisted of Empire City 1939, Dead Angle, and Dynamite Duke. These three games helped to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become one of the industry's most enduring genres. Turn back now if you don't want to know what happens next, because today we're going to spoil the story and ending for Empire City 1931, Dead Angle, and Dynamite Duke. This is Game Over, the early years. Although Seibu's third-person trilogy is probably best known for having outlines around the character on screen, it started out with a much more modest design. Empire City 1931 was first released in arcades in 1986 and had players moving a simple cursor around the screen as they gunned down old-timey gangsters. But just because you don't see the outline doesn't mean that we're not standing behind the hero. You can see him on screen every time he's about to get shot, giving us a small taste of what's in store with Dead Angle and Dynamite Duke. But look, instead of talking about the camera perspective, let's actually dive into the story. This is a crime thriller set between April 10th and September 14th, 1931 that revolves around a young FBI agent who makes it his job to take out the mob. He's motivated by the death of his family, who were recently caught in the middle of a gang shootout. This is clearly a man on a mission to kill every gangster that he can see, and you can tell because he spends countless days mowing down streets both during the day and the night. There's a point in mid-July where he finally goes into a building and, kills everybody inside. This is followed by a trip to the mob's warehouse, which is full of barrels and boxes. Now that he's cleared out all the guards and lackeys, it's up to the young FBI agent to kill the mob boss and get his sweet revenge. This is what happens next. Just when you thought you were out, they pull you back in. Much like our trip to Empire City, Dead Angle takes us back to the mob-controlled 1931. This time around, we play private investigator George Phoenix, who is hot off of putting one of the mob's biggest crime lords behind bars for good. His name is Robert King, and he vows to take revenge on the private dick, but our hero isn't too worried about it. In truth, the only thing on his mind is taking his beautiful girlfriend Jane on a romantic getaway to Italy. But tragedy strikes when Jane is captured, revealing that King has escaped jail and rounded up the usual suspects. This sets up a cat-and-mouse game where George Phoenix shoots his way through mobsters in hopes of killing Robert King once and for all. This starts in Italy, but he quickly takes the investigation on a boat that is en route to New York City. After fighting through the docks, he gets a tip that King's gang is in one of the Big Apple's seedier hotels. This certainly seems like the right place, but alas, the only thing he can find is information leading him to Kansas? Yeah, as strange as it sounds, that's where George goes next. He shoots up a farm and scares a whole bunch of animals, only to, once again, come up empty. Gee, who could have seen that coming? So, after wasting everybody's time by going to the Heartland, George makes a smart decision and starts gunning down mobsters at Robert King's mansion in Chicago. Yeah, forget all about Kansas and New York City, because this is clearly the place they should have started the investigation. The deeper in George gets, the clearer it becomes that this is where Jane is being held. This hunch is confirmed when our hero finally squares off against the mob boss King. After trying to use Jane as a human shield, George gets the final shot, and this is what happens next. Before we move on to Dynamite Duke, I first want to talk about the Sega Master System port of Dead Angle. While it's largely the exact same game, give or take a few levels, it does change up the ending in a small but important way. It not only redraws the characters, but it also adds dialogue. Okay, granted, the dialogue's been lifted from old movies, but I mean, it's more than we got from the arcade version. Here's the Master System ending. The final game in the Seibu Trilogy takes us about as far away from the 1930s as we can get. Dynamite Duke takes place at the dawn of the 22nd century, when the Earth has become a gigantic barbecue. We're at the point where holes in the ozone layer are so big that people are actually being toasted alive. Yeah, things are bad, and we clearly should have listened to Al Gore. But instead of trying to solve the problem, the Global Alliance put their research into creating a new type of human that can survive a full blast of the sun's radiation. There's just one problem. The man behind the project, Dr. Neil Ash, went missing almost immediately after he made his discovery. Look, to make a long story short, it turns out that Dr. Ash has been working at an unknown military base on the desolate island Rantan. And when I say working, what I really mean is that he's been creating an army of mutants to seize control of the world. The good news is that the Global Alliance has Dynamite Duke on speed dial. I'm of course talking about Colonel Duke Rippins, a man who was rebuilt using bionic parts after suffering a near-fatal dynamite blast. With a lethal right arm, Duke is the only man with enough metal guts to stop Dr. Ash. Alright, look, I get it. I'm dumping a whole lot of setup on you. And you know what? Compared to the rest of the Seibu third-person shooters, this one is certainly the most ambitious. But don't let any of that throw you, because Dynamite Duke does a pretty good job of keeping the rest of the story on the island of Rantan. Believe me, nobody's going to be going to Kansas in this game. Instead, what we have is our hero fighting through a whole bunch of believable locations, such as an occupied city, the woods, this underground tunnel, the entrance to Ash's mutant factory, the mutant factory that I just mentioned, and then the incubator facility. It all ends with a one-on-one battle against the evil doctor right in front of an atomic reactor. He's extremely easy to kill, but wait a second, what's this? What'd you know? He has a secret. Instead of dying, he comes back to life as a green mutant. Hang on a second, what game does Dr. Ash think he's in? Resident Evil? Alright, Duke eventually knocks him off the platform, but don't look now because we're still not done with this fight. After shooting up a floating mutant blob, a bionic commando finally defeats Dr. Ash, and this is what happens next. Obviously, none of these endings are all that elaborate. These are arcade games after all. In fact, when it comes to Empire City 1931, I'm not even sure that I'd call it an ending. It's just a title card, followed by all the levels repeating again. You know, so they can spend more money. Of the three, I'd say that Dead Angle has the best conclusion. I like how we see the villain burst through the window, followed by a couple more scenes that reinforce the couple's love. Even the Master System version is good, though the dialogue is completely unnecessary. By far, the most frustrating ending is Dynamite Duke. Not because it's basically just a big wall of text, but rather because it breaks the fourth wall for no reason. It isn't really an ending for the video game character Dynamite Duke, but rather the stupid ending pulls back the curtain and reveals that he's just a video game character that you've been controlling. I mean, I get it, he is a video game character that we've been controlling, but the whole idea is to get lost in the game and feel like the hero. This gives us no closure for Duke, instead opting to praise the player's skills. Hell, they even put Duke's name in quotes. It's just not very satisfying, since all it takes to beat the game is enough quarters. And to end it with a dare that you can't pour more quarters into the machine to beat it again? Yeah, screw you, Dynamite Duke. The only thing good about your ending is this awesome picture of your chances of getting a sequel exploding into a million little pieces. What, too soon? Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Game Over, the early years. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes almost every week. Now, here's the question I have for you. Which Seibu game had the best ending? Look, I get it. These aren't exactly the most riveting conclusions, but I think they all tried something a little different. Personally, I like the Dead Angle one the best, but I can see there being some Duke defenders. I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with reviews of The Wine and Darius Burst, another Chronicle EX+. We'll also be checking in with the old school critics to see what they thought of the upcoming Nintendo Switch Online retro releases. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.